So I'm going to be talking more on general aspects of nutrients, and Andy's going to be talking. Sorry, Grant's going to be talking more on the on specific aspects of alum. In order to sort of understand what I'm talking about, I'll just give you a very basic. This is sort of almost biochemistry 101. Traditionally, farmers relied a lot on nitrogen fixation. That was an enormous input of nitrogen from agriculture in New Zealand farms. And unlike the rest of the world that found out that you could synthesize nitrogen artificially, it took about 20 or 30 years for New Zealand to really cotton on to that. And we had some of the best nitrogen fixation research around the world, I think. And it was incredible how much it brought in to enrich the landscape. Increasingly, we import a lot, and this comes from overseas mostly. It also some of it comes from New Zealand, but we put this on to basically, and we've turned away a lot from the clover and the nitrogen fixers and more towards the rye and so on, which is very good at taking up some of this. One of the consequences of what we call intensification is you put more animals on the landscape, and the inefficiency is not so much putting on the fertiliser, because we're a lot better at that now, but it's actually the animals that do it, because that's where the inefficiency is. Unfortunately, and particularly if you get a big dairy cow, then it typically pees about 5 litres in one go, and that urine is mostly in the form of ammonium. The ammonium gets oxidised to nitrate, and nitrate is what I guess the Parliamentary Commission have said that there was a sticky one, which is the phosphorus, and that tends to adhere to particles or sediments. And there's I don't know what she called the other one, but the nitrate, and that very easily goes through the soil profile. It doesn't adhere at all to the soil profile, through to the sediments. So the consequence of it is that where that animal pees, ultimately, particularly if you get a fresh rainfall and it's the middle of winter, it's likely to run down and into the aquifer and enrich the aquifer. And that's exactly what's happened in the Taupo volcanic zone, is that we're enriching this aquifer down here. We're not enriching it a lot because it started with very low concentrations, but we are progressively enriching it. If you go to Canterbury, then you'll find concentrations that may be high enough to cause what they used to call blue baby syndrome, where this nitrate, when you ingest it, if for example you're taking bore water, then the nitrate gets reduced to nitrite and combines with the hemoglobin in your blood. And babies in particular are sensitive to it and can actually suffocate if you were to feed very high concentrations of nitrate in, for example, formula milk, if you were using bore water to do that. Now you need very high concentrations, but the Medical Officer for Health in Canterbury has expressed some concerns that in Canterbury at least that is an issue. Here it's not an issue. Our concentrations are much lower, at least currently, and our aquifers are much larger, but they are being enriched. And the consequences of that enrichment is that they have environmental effects. And the nitrate ultimately goes into some system like Lake Rotorua. Now the story with phosphorus is quite different, and it's particularly interesting in this region, and that is that obviously we're bringing in superphosphate and so on. And again, the same sort of story, except in this particular case, it's not so much the animals that have the same effect. It's more to do with simply erosion and runoff primarily. That's been the primary target, and hence why you want to revegetate some areas and why you want to maintain sediments that, of course, are your productive land on the land. But the other interesting thing about this region is that there's a very deep layer of ignimbrite down here, right down in the deepest part of the aquifer. And And that ignimbrite, for whatever reason, starts to leach out some of the phosphorus that's contained in it. So we know that the deep aquifer ultimately will feed into the lake through the water table, and you'll see that in Hamarana and Oahu. Though they have actually quite high levels of phosphate naturally occurring because of that deep ignimbrite volcanic layer that's in there. And so as a consequence, we have naturally high levels of phosphate that are present. And so it's one of the reasons why back about 20 years ago they said, well, let's focus on nitrogen, because this lake is so enriched in phosphorus that we're not going to be able to control it anyway. And I'll show you something that's changed quite radically in relation to that very shortly. So, two sources: what comes off the land, and we know that the Kaituna catchment scheme was a very valuable scheme in stopping some of the sediment and some of the erosion and the phosphorus from entering our systems. At the same time, there's been a lot more intensification. So the two are sort of working against each other. Much better management practices, but much more intensive practices in agriculture nowadays. The other thing we need to consider is this deep aquifer that's supplying a naturally high level of phosphorus. So what happens, what we've been doing, and Andy just mentioned this very briefly in the project that we've been running with, is we've been trying to decipher, well, what's natural and what's what we call anthropogenic, of human origin. And it's very, very interesting. You see, there's about 23 tonnes of phosphorus coming into the lake out of the 48, roughly, that's actually natural. So what can you do about that? Well, there may be means to deal with it, but essentially it's natural. It's always been here. And if you look to these very large, deep aquifers, for example, Hamarana, where the average residence time in the aquifer is about 110 or so years, then it's quite enriched in phosphorus. And it's only got a tiny anthropogenic load, a tiny human-induced load. And likewise, Oahu, a huge natural load and a relatively small human-induced load. So, if you're going to start targeting things, well, they may not be the catchments that you're going to start to have a look at first of all. And again, I'll just make the point that it's nitrogen and phosphorus in this lake that influence the productivity or the amount of algal growth that you get. All of our work has shown that it's nitrogen and phosphorus. There is absolutely no doubt about that. Both of them are a very strong influence. Sometimes it's phosphorus more strongly than nitrogen, at other times it's phosphorus. In some places it's nitrogen that more strongly influences algal growth, at other times, at other places it's phosphorus. And what became interesting as we looked through this was, well, there's actually quite a big ungauged catchment, and we think that that's roughly balanced between what's natural and what's actually human related. So here's the baseline, natural. Here's the anthropogenic. This includes some ungauged catchments, some of the smaller streams that feed in. It also includes quite a lot of the urban area. So it does say that we may need to look closely at whereabouts some of our sources of phosphorus are actually coming from. This is not to say that these catchments are totally immune from the phosphorus loads. If you put so much phosphorus on, that phosphorus might eventually get down into the groundwater, or if you enriched a lot of the phosphorus on the landscape, then it might ultimately reach the aquifer and affect the lake. But it would be almost difficult to do so. It's got a huge capacity to take up that anthropogenic phosphorus. This one is total phosphorus. Okay, so the one I showed you was dissolved phosphorus before. This is the total phosphorus, and you'll see some subtle changes here. Again, this ungauged catchment, quite a large part. The anthropogenic TP load has a large component which is actually particulate phosphorus. it's something that we can do something with. So let me just outline the figures again. We've got about 23 tonnes of phosphorus coming into the lake naturally. That means we've got about 25 tonnes which is coming through human activities. Of that 25 tonnes, most of it is in particle form. So the phosphorus is actually attached to sediments. So the target, if we're going to target that anthropogenic phosphorus, has to be targeting good land management to be able to stop some of the erosion of sediments and reduce that amount. And we estimate that maybe about 11 or 12 tonnes of reduction of anthropogenic phosphorus is required to meet the sort of lake target out of that 25 or so tonnes. So you're talking about a very big chunk to be able to meet your land-based targets. Now, I just want to lead into Grant Tempero's talk and tell you what's happened in the lake, because we've taken out more than 11 tonnes of phosphorus out of the lake. It's currently sitting attached to aluminium in the bottom of the lake because we've been putting in a very high dose of aluminium. This is litres per hour of aluminium that's gone into the lake. There simply wasn't enough time for me to be able to convert that into kilograms for you, but in some cases it's around 700 or 800 kilos as a peak in any one day of aluminium going into the lake. It's put in through two inflows, the Utahina and the Puarenga. Okay, it started in the Utahina in 2006, and it was supplemented in the Puarenga in 2010. Got it right, yep. So the red line is our dissolved reactive phosphorus, and you see these very big peaks which represent the seasonality. They're actually nutrient releases from the bottom sediments in many cases. So during the summer, the lake stratifies, the bottom waters become devoid of oxygen and start releasing a whole lot of phosphorus, and that mixes up through the water, and you see these really quite high peaks. And in terms of the size of those peaks, you don't want anything over 30 really. 30 is pretty bad news in terms of dissolved phosphorus in the lake. So the pre-alum, we were regularly getting in summers over 30. Once the alum came in, you can see the effect's quite dramatic. There was a big release event here that occurred under moderate levels of alum dosing. Once the Puarenga was online and at the peak dosages, pretty well dropped the phosphorus away to zero. This is the point where there's so little phosphorus in the lake that you can't grow the algae. The lake's clear. There's a very good reason why it's clear, because there's no phosphorus. Gee, wrong one. There's no phosphorus. Almost no phosphorus, except for the summer of 2015. We all know what happened there. It was incredibly warm, it was incredibly calm for about 6 weeks, and in that time Rotorua stratified. It didn't mix between surface and bottom waters. The bottom waters became devoid of oxygen and releases occurred from the bottom sediments. So we know that the alum doesn't totally protect the bottom sediments from releases of phosphorus into the future. This is the type of scenario that we would predict under a future climate. So we've done a number of simulations and we said, well, this might be what the lake looks like under a warmer climate of 2 or 3 degrees when the lake won't mix quite as often. But I think you'd agree, it's absolutely dramatic. It is almost, well, you don't need a scientist to tell you what you see in front of you. There's total phosphorus. Total phosphorus more or less mimics the dissolved phosphorus component. And once again, to re-emphasise the point, the very high doses of alum here correspond to very low levels of total phosphorus. Most of that phosphorus is being taken out of the water column and it can't fuel algal growth within the lake. The other thing that we looked at is total phosphorus to total nitrogen ratios. Now the ratio is important because it can give you information about which of those nutrients, nitrogen or phosphorus, is more strongly limiting algal growth. So if, for example, I was a farmer and I knew that my soil was depleted of nitrogen, I'd put more nitrogen on and boost the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. Also, if I was a farmer and I had low nitrogen to phosphorus ratios, I know that I might get quite a bit of clover growing to balance that nitrogen. Now the same thing happens in lakes, and in particular under low nitrogen to phosphorus ratios you're at much greater risk of getting blooms of blue-green algae. And so down here you can see the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio was down around 10, and once you get it down around 5, you're really at quite a strong risk of getting those nitrogen fixing blue-green algae that, because they're so deficient in nitrogen, they fix the nitrogen, they actually fix it from nitrogen gas in the water to balance up the ratio. Hence why I believe there were a lot of cyanobacterial or blue-green algal blooms at that time. And then if you look what's happened more recently, you can see this beautiful relationship with maybe a little bit of a lag between the ratio of nitrogen to phosphorus and the amount of alum that's gone in. So you feed in a whole lot of alum, it strips out the phosphorus in particular, and as a result your nitrogen to phosphorus ratio increases. And it provides a level of safety in a way because you're less likely to get the low ratios under which you might get nitrogen fixation occurring down here. So the alum has been incredibly successful, but remember we're talking about 800 kilograms of alum going into the lake at some of those peak levels. I'm going to whiz through these slides very quickly because I know that Grant's got quite a bit to talk about. Of course, my underlying concern about this is that the alum has been used, and we've shown very good relationships of improving water quality in 3 lakes in particular: Okaro, Rotorua, Rotoahu. It's no coincidence that all of those lakes have been alum dosed, and my concern relates to the fact it's taken the heat off the types of mitigation and good land use practices that are urgently required. So if you look at this case here, you'll see where there were a series of alum doses represented by the blue arrows, and you'll see in Lake Okaro you've been progressively able to reduce the TLI down to below the target represented by the stark dashed line here. In Lake Rotorua, much the same thing. Again, an alum dosing started here on a continuous basis, and you can see that the 3-year TLI, trophic level index, has declined progressively since that time. And then you go to Rotorua, and remember, started about 2006 and reaching targets for the TLI. No coincidence that the alum has been pretty well regulated now to be able to meet those trophic level index targets. And again, to emphasise the concern being that you're regulating water quality in these lakes effectively artificially and not by what is actually coming into the lakes.
So this is where I came in with the report to the Bay of Plenty Regional Council, looking at potential toxic effects for alum. So the first thing we need to go through is and educate ourselves on is what is alum. Well, alum is basically a salt, aluminium sulfate. It's very, very commonly used in purification of water systems. So if you've got a green, murky swimming pool, you'll chuck aluminium sulfate in as a flocculant. What this will do was it'll cause all those floating particles to clump together and sink to the bottom, and then you can suck them out with your pool cleaner. Similar process is used in treating of drinking water. Alum is added to your drinking water to flocculate all the particles out to clean it up. You also find it in common things like baking powder. Alum is added to it to acidify the cake batter and to cause the release of carbon dioxide, which gives you the bubbles, which causes your cake to rise. So alum is incredibly common. Aluminium is the main component that we're interested in with alum. It's what binds the phosphorus and prevents its release. Aluminium is one of the most common elements in the Earth's crust, so it's everywhere. You find aluminium and aluminium sulfate everywhere. David talked about very high uses of alum in the Rotorua lakes. That's a relative term. The figures that you see here are the lake concentrations of aluminium. So the Lake Rotorua is dosed through the Udahina and Puringa streams, and that provides a total lake concentration of nearly 79 micrograms of aluminium. So very, very small concentration. Similarly, Lake Rotorua is dosed through the Waitangi soda springs. This is just slightly higher. And Lake Okaro is not continually dosed, but they do regular alum dosings, single doses, and the maximum dose of that was 245 micrograms per litre. What does that all mean? Well, let's put it into some international context. Internationally, it's considered to be a low dose range if you're dosing in between 100 and 200 micrograms per litre. A high dose range, so more towards 500, is what you may be dosing some North American lakes with. And when you get up to 2,000, this is sort of like sludge ponds, which they'll treat aluminium with. So you can see in the context of international water treatment systems or lake mitigation treatment systems, the concentrations within the Rotorua lakes are actually quite low. Some more basic alum facts. When you add aluminium sulfate to water, it forms a new compound, which is aluminium hydroxide, and it also releases a hydrogen ion, and this affects pH, and we'll get onto that in a moment. But it's aluminium hydroxide is what actually binds the phosphorus. Aluminium hydroxide is a harmless white solid at neutral pH. So somewhere between 6 and 9 pH, you just get this white precipitate. And here you can see it downstream of the Waitangi soda stream going into Lake Rotorua. It's just this harmless white precipitate. And that's what's binding the phosphorus. And as soon as you add the alum to the water, it starts binding the phosphorus. Unfortunately, it will only bind phosphorus in this pH 6 to 9 range. Outside of that range, it will actually release phosphorus because it becomes soluble again. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. The other problem is that when you add alum to water, when you get this release of the hydrogen ions, which causes a decrease in pH, it acidifies the water. So when you're dosing alum to water and you're forming aluminium hydroxide, causing this hydrogen ion release, you're also decreasing the pH. And you're going to see that this is not a good thing in terms of toxicity. like I said, at pH 6 to 9, aluminium is not toxic because it's insoluble. It forms this harmless white solid. Outside of that range, if you're becoming more and more acidic, you start to get the formation of free aluminium ions, or if you're increasing pH, which you can get under some natural conditions, you get the formulation of 1 negative aluminium hydroxide. Both of these are soluble, they dissolve in water, and they're extremely toxic to aquatic organisms. Okay, so you have the safe zone between about pH 5.5 up to about 9, where you get the formation of aluminium hydroxide, and this is most natural systems. So you're okay dosing into these natural systems. Okay, that is binding phosphorus. Outside of these ranges, not only are you causing not binding phosphorus, but you're also causing the formation of toxic aluminium species. So what does this toxicity look like? Well, I went through an awful lot of literature over a 3-month period in an effort to try and work out what would be a sort of a safe, a recommended dosing level. It turns out that fish are the most susceptible to aluminium toxicity. When it's toxic, you get respiratory and osmoregulatory problems in fish. Same thing for invertebrates, so things like insects, kura, snails, mollusks, anything like that. Plants are less susceptible, and birds right down the bottom. You actually have to get to incredibly high, unbelievably high aluminium concentrations before you have a problem with affecting bird life. So it's just not realistic. You'll never ever get that up that high. Similarly, plants, you would need extraordinarily high aluminium levels to affect plant life. So the problem with aluminium toxicity is this problem with the fact that you have an interaction between pH and aluminium. So we've talked about this. Not only is aluminium toxic outside of these ranges, but pH is also toxic outside of these ranges. So you get this compounding problem. As you decrease pH, not only does aluminium become more toxic, but pH in and of itself is more toxic. And in fact, once you hit sort of pH 3, fish are going to die from pH toxicity anyway. Similarly, once you start getting up around pH 10, fish are just going to start dying from pH toxicity, not only aluminium toxicity. Fortunately, as you saw before, current alum dosing rates to the lakes are well below the level that I recommend, which is 200 micrograms per litre. Now, the problem with that is it's based on a pH of 6, between 6 and 9. If you drop the pH below 6, that amount of aluminium that you can safely have in the environment is going to decrease as well. So therefore, it's very, very important that you maintain that pH range between 6 and 9. How does this work for the Rotorua lakes? Unfortunately for the Rotorua lakes, a lot of them have very low to low buffering capacity. Buffering capacity is the amount the lake can resist a change in pH, whether that's an increase in pH or a decrease in pH. If you have a very low buffering capacity, then it's going to take a lot less environmental change to shift the pH than if you had a high buffering capacity. And this comes back to the problem. If you want to go and put more alum into the lake, you're going to have an acidification problem, remember? Because as you add more alum, you lower the pH even more. Lakes like Rotorua have a very low resistance to that change in pH. If you drop that pH too much, if you drop it below 5.5, down and below, you're just going to really start having toxicity problems. In the other lakes, you've got a bit more of a buffer. Rotorua has moderate buffering capacity, therefore you have the capacity to add a little bit more aluminium. But for the most part, things like Arawa and above, you've got a very limited capacity in which you can add aluminium. Again, there's a lot of that sort of covers what we know. There's also a big problem in what we don't know. And the big unknown is what are the long-term effects of aluminium in the environment. And I was very surprised actually there's very little published information on long-term effects. There's a lot of information on short-term aluminium effects, that's quite well known and studied. Long-term effects, not so much. So when we talk long-term effects, we're talking months to years. We know that with discrete dosing, such as what we're doing in Arawa, okay, that raises the aluminium concentrations up above, but that's for a very, very limited period of time, a couple of days. And from the monitoring that has been done, it shows that we've seen that there's no real effect on the biota by doing that. Okay, they can cope with that. Continuous dosing, as occurs in the Udahina, Paringa, again, monitoring seems to show that the biota seems to be handling it quite well. Whether this occurs in 10, 20, 30 years out, nobody knows. Nobody's done studies of more than a few months on exposing biota to aluminium. So we just don't know. What also makes it more complicated is we don't know what effect multiple stresses could we have. We know that aluminium is probably causing a little bit of a stressor to the biota, but they can handle it for the most part. But what happens when you start piling on? What happens when you start getting climate change, increases in temperature? What happens if you get more cyanobacterial blooms and toxins? All these stresses compounding, we just don't know. Another big factor is we don't know what aluminium has on microbial processes. So what's happening in the lake sediment? Is all this aluminium we're putting into the lake, is that somehow affecting the microbial community? Nobody's ever bothered to look at that. What effect is it having on these natural geochemical cycles, nitrogen cycles within the lake, sulfur cycles, silica cycles, things like that? Again, nobody's ever really bothered to look at that, so we just don't know. Finally, what happens to the aluminium once it's discharged into the lake? Well, most of the time you'll see it as this white precipitate. This is sulphur bay in Lake Rotorua. Not all of this is aluminium, okay? Don't worry about that, okay? But a certain fraction of it is, but because this is a geothermal area, there's lots of other chemicals in there that'll be causing that precipitate, so don't worry too much. But what happens is that over time, this white precipitate will either go out of the outflow, or if it's in Rotorua or Lake Rotorua, it'll sink to the bottom, as it will in Rotorua, and over time it crystallizes and forms little microcrystals. This gets incorporated into the sediment, and any phosphorus that is bound to that aluminium hydroxide is incorporated into this mineral gibbsite, which which is what aluminium hydroxide forms as it crystallizes. It's buried in the sediment and it's lost over time. So, what can we take home as a message from tonight? Well, for aluminium to bind phosphorus, it has a specific pH range it requires so that it's insoluble. Outside of that pH range, outside of pH 6 to 9, it's soluble and it doesn't bind phosphorus anymore. Also, outside of that pH range, it starts to become more and more toxic. We know from our calculations that the current dosing rates by international standards are low. Okay, but they need to be low because a lot of the lakes have a very limited buffering capacity, and so you can't put too much in without risking a toxicological event. For this reason, long-term strategies to control both nitrogen and phosphorus are needed. Alum works well as a short to medium-term solution to help get us off on the right foot, but there's just too much unknown about it to look at this as a long-term solution. Thank you.